Thank you all for coming. Oh, that's loud. My mom really would have loved to see you all. Before I dive in, I would like to take a moment to thank those of you that helped my mom in her declining years so that she could live at home with dignity, joy, and love. For that, we are very grateful. All the people at Grace Hospice, you helped us understand what was happening and what she needed with enormous compassion and skill. Not to mention support for everyone in our family. To her caregivers, especially Shar and Mary, thank you for all your dedication and support. All of you, in your many ways, were the helping hand we needed so we could focus on loving our mom. We thank you from the deepest place in our hearts. And now, on to my mommy. My mommy loved to be in nature, especially if she had something to help her get some speed to feel free, such as sailing or ice skating. In her later years, her body prevented her from doing those things. But now she's free from that body. So after her death, during my short time back in Boulder, Colorado, I invited her to join me on a mountain bike ride. And boy, did she. Throughout the ride, little snippets of mommy wisdom kept coming up. They quickly revealed themselves to be metaphors for how to live life. In one section of this ride, there's a tough uphill climb, and you can't just go straight up because there are little rocks and gullies along the way that you have to dodge. She told me, pick a path, and if it turns out to not be perfect, just do your best, adjust, and keep going. She reminded me that you can enjoy the struggle of an uphill climb. That looking ahead is helpful, but it's important to enjoy the present so you don't miss the beautiful vista or the clump of wildflowers. Sometimes I needed to put my foot down to stay stable. She was giving me support and showing me how to be strong. Sometimes I had to stop. It was hard, but she encouraged me to breathe and then keep going. She said, sometimes someone passes you. Maybe you can help by stepping aside and making it a little easier for them. Or sometimes you may need to ask people to wait for you because there's only so much room. That's okay. You deserve to take up that time and space. She also reminded me that detours are an adventure. Take them. On this particular trail, you can get going kind of fast on the downhill, all the while dodging those little rocks and gullies. She had never mountain biked before, and I didn't want her to feel scared, so I told her, don't worry, I got this. It'll be okay. Just enjoy the ride. I think she was really telling me, you got this. It'll be okay. Even in death, she's guiding me and the rest of us through life. Let's take this time to celebrate who she was. Thank you.
Okay, so our mother, Inie Bijeker, did have a really remarkable life. So I thought I'd try my best to tell that story of her life. So it starts with the marriage of her parents, André Stavitsa and Berendina Manhave. And this is the house that she grew up in Landsmeer in the Netherlands. And this was a house that was attached to a school in the back, and her father was the headmaster of this 3-room school. And this is Inie, right after she was born. And this is her with her mother and her older brother. He was 1.5 years older. And then 3 years later, a sister was born. And these are a couple of school pictures. Some people have said, well, she looks like Anne Frank. But that's because that's how they posed for school pictures in the Netherlands at that time. And she's about the same age. So this is her about the time that she graduated from elementary school and went off to secondary school. So the elementary school had a very short commute, but the secondary school, she had to ride a bike 7 miles into Amsterdam and back every day, and that included a ferry ride. So unfortunately, toward the end of her first year in secondary school, the Germans decided to attack the Netherlands. And one of the first things that they did, one of the first things that they did was to bomb Rotterdam. And then they said, okay, tomorrow we will hit another large city if you don't surrender. So the Dutch wisely said, we're a lot smaller than you are, so they surrendered. So it was only a 5-day war. And this was, of course, really scary for everybody, including my mother. So just before her 13th birthday, she saw German soldiers come marching into her town, taking over. When she rode her bicycle back and forth to school, she rode past this large airplane factory, which was taken over by the Germans to make, their military planes. And so it was a target for bombing missions. And she rode right past this thing to school. So in July of 1943, it was first targeted by the Americans, who would fly really high, and not a single bomb hit the factory, but they hit all kinds of other things, and killing quite a few people. The next day, the British came and they flew low and they wiped out the factory. So next time she rode past there, the factory was gone. So what happened next was the Dutch hunger winter. And this really shaped her life a lot. So what happened was that the Germans just kind of cut off all transportation from the eastern part of the Netherlands to the western part of the Netherlands. And so there was no electricity, there was no gas, there was no coal, and there was extremely little food. And so she remembered going to a junkyard like this one, whoops, I didn't mean to do that, like this one, and trying to find small pieces of coal that had not quite burned so that they could cook their food. And the way they cooked their food was in these little tiny stoves. And they didn't have any heat, so they would all be huddled around the stove in their winter coats, trying to stay warm. And there were soup kitchens. She was assigned the task of ladling out the soup. It was a very thin soup, but it was at least a soup. This isn't a picture of her, but she looks a lot like the person who is doing that there. And if she got really lucky, there was a little extra at the end of the day that she could bring home. And then, finally, Just before the end of the war, there was this sort of handshake agreement between the Germans in charge of the Netherlands and the Americans and British that if you fly your bombers really low and drop food, we will not shoot you down. It was a big risk because would they believe the Germans or not? But anyway, they did it, and so that, starting that day, they started dropping food. And so my mother remembers standing on the roof, seeing this bomber come flying really low and dropping food, and she waved, and the pilot waved back. So then officially the Netherlands was liberated on May 5th. And so she and some friends got on their bicycles. On May 7th, they'd heard there was going to be a big celebration in Amsterdam. So they rode their bicycles to the central square in Amsterdam, and there were huge crowds of people. It was just wall-to-wall people, all so excited because the war had ended. The only problem was that there were still armed German soldiers, and they were scared. And nobody really knows exactly what happened, but what they do know is that the Germans started shooting from a building nearby. And so my mother and her friends and all of these people ran and tried to find cover. She got caught in this narrow little alleyway, and there were all these people crushing her and everybody else trying to get in, and someone kind of pulled her through a door into a building, and she got away. There were about 30 people killed, and she knew some of them. So this was a really bittersweet ending to the war. Then finally, right after that, the Canadians came. It was the Canadians that sort of reoccupied the Netherlands, and they were very enthusiastically welcomed by the Dutch people. So the war was finally over, and she could have fun again, and she did. So she was 18 years old. She got to skip the last year of high school because of the hunger winter, and they just said, okay, everybody passes. So she didn't have to take all those final exams. And she went to a school for social work, but then decided she really wanted to go to the university. So she went to the university and traveled a lot, participated in women's organizations at the university. If you can tell which one is her, it's that one. And this is a bigger group, and she's right there at the top. And according to my father, she was someone who would dole out wisdom already, even at that age. And this is her and her friends going off on another trip. So she was studying psychology, and she got a job at the Psychological Institute at the university. And my father also worked there. She was there first. So in 1951, they met. They were not a couple right away, though. They were just working in the same building, and she was sometimes his supervisor. And he had to go off to the military for a couple of years and come back. But then, in 1956, they sort of became a couple, and at the end of the year, they got engaged. And so in 1957, they got married. And there's another wedding picture. I like to imagine her laughing at the hat that he has on. 9 months and 6 days later, I was born. And then in August, so just 6 weeks later, they got on a boat and went to America and came to Grand Rapids, where my father taught in a temporary position at Calvin College for 2 years. And during that time, here, my brother Rulof was born. And so the 2 years ended, and they went back to the Netherlands, and my sister Eileen was born. And my father worked feverishly on his dissertation, finished that, and then he was invited by Calvin College to have a permanent position. So they immigrated, and of course, she seems to be really involved in a lot of historical events. So it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis that they flew across the ocean, not knowing what they were going to find when they landed. And also, the immigration was a team effort. Back then, there were quotas by country, and the quota for the Netherlands, this is fine print, so you probably can't see it, but it was over 3,000 a year could get in. But for those who were born in Asia, which my father was, the quota was 1,300 for the entire continent of Asia, and it would have never happened except that my father was married to my mother, and in 1961 they changed the law so that if one person could get in, the other one could come too. So this was a team effort here. Well then, she followed the pattern, so after going across the ocean again, she had another baby. She had Jeannie in 1963. So in 6 years, less than 6 years, they went from their wedding to having 4 children. She was very, very busy during that time. And here just are some pictures of her during that time, some of the favorites that I could find. And these are pictures of Rule and Inie together. And so here we are in 1967. So 4 children was enough. So we were growing. And so when Jeannie got old enough to go to preschool, my mother decided it was time to restart her career. And so she started teaching at Calvin College, and she taught there part-time for 2 years. So here we are in 1970. And then my mother started getting really involved in the women's movement, in feminism. She was part of that second wave, and she went to consciousness-raising groups and started really meeting a lot of wonderful people, some of whom might be in this room, and made a lot of friends and started doing all kinds of activities with these women. So in 1973, we as a family made our first trip back to the Netherlands since we immigrated in 1962. So she had grown up eating herring. You take the whole fish, I think they're smoked, maybe not, and you take it by the tail and you hold it up and eat it. So she was showing us how to do that. And then she decided that she wanted to write a dissertation. And so we went back to the Netherlands for a year when my father was on sabbatical, and she worked on a dissertation during that time. And here I just found this, you can hardly see it, but it's a page that she wrote. Unfortunately, things had changed a lot, and so the kinds of things they wanted her to do didn't really fit what she wanted to do. For the dissertation, she wanted to write something on the psychology of women, and so they wanted it to be a little more experimental than she wanted. So she did not finish the dissertation. But this is her in the Netherlands. And one of the nice things about being there is that we got to see relatives. So this is the Bijkerk clan. Whoops. So that's her right there. And my father and his brothers and mother, and lots of their offspring. So we came back here, and she decided to start teaching again. So she was teaching at Grand Valley at William James College, and she set up a private psychotherapy practice. So this is her in 1982. And this is the family. And again. And her reputation really grew with time, her professional reputation. And she wrote a book together with a former client, and that was published in 1987. And she continued to do all kinds of activities with women. And so here's photos of a workshop that they did. I think this was at Morning Star, where they would make masks. So this is her in her mask. Whoops, I keep doing this backwards. There's her in her mask. Oh, okay. I'm a professor, you'd think I could do this. Okay, so then the grandbabies started. So the first one was Alex, born in 1988. And then the second one was Alan, born the next year. And so there's Alan and Alex, and this is Rule's mother and the rest of the family. And they got a little older. And then another grandbaby. So Rose was born in 1996. And then Benjamin was born in 1997. And Inie always really tried to be there for every grandbaby that was born. She unfortunately had to have hip surgery right before Benjamin was born, so she didn't quite make it for that, but she was there soon after. And then Quentin was born in 1999. And all this time, Inie continued to pursue her hobbies that she really enjoyed. So one of them was hiking, anything to do with outdoors she would enjoy, and traveling. That was a time when my parents would travel back to the Netherlands often, and visit other countries in Europe together with their brothers and sisters. So here is Inie with her brother and sister. And so in 2007, she celebrated her 80th birthday, so that's the occasion that we took this picture. And so we had a family reunion. And then she had a private practice all these years. So around 2010, when she was just over 80 years old, she decided, okay, I think I will retire now. And she enjoyed her retirement very much. Here she is at the beach. And the last plane ride that she took was to come all the way to California to attend the marriage of Alan and his wife Sherry in 2014. So at this point she was 87 years old. But then we all came the next year and had another family reunion. And then she turned 90. Isn't she a beautiful 90? So we had another family reunion at Lake Michigan at a house there, and that I think was the last time she went to Lake Michigan. Shortly after that, she started having symptoms of dementia and was pretty much homebound, except for visits to the doctor, which is not very exciting. Or people would take her outside for walks in a wheelchair. So here's at her 90th birthday celebration. My father is telling a story. I think she's being a little bit skeptical about this story. And there's the family that includes a niece and nephew of hers that came from the Netherlands. And in her 80s, she started knitting a lot again. She had always done it off and on through the years. She was a very excellent knitter. And she knit, I don't know how many pairs of socks. This is just 5 pairs that I pulled out of her drawer. And she gave them away freely to family and friends, and she could whip these out really fast. And they last forever. They're amazing, amazing socks. Here she is in 2019, so she could still get out in a wheelchair. And this is in the condo complex where she lived. And then at the end of 2019, she had a great grandbaby. And unfortunately, COVID happened. We had been planning a family reunion in 2020, and we couldn't do it. So she never got to meet her great-granddaughter. But she spent many hours looking at pictures of her great-granddaughter. And she always knew who she was. So toward the end of her life, she insisted on being out on the porch as much as possible. So in the afternoons and evenings, she would be out on the porch. She would have her lunch and her dinner there often. And this is the view from the porch. Even in the winter, if the sun was shining in, it was warm enough if we had a heater in there. And so she watched the seasons go by. And she would knit sometimes when she was out there. And she worked on a project painting some birdhouses out there on the porch. And this is in late May, so we sort of took care of her in shifts, and this was a shift change here. So I was leaving that day, and Eileen had just arrived. And there's her 94th birthday. She had a nice party. And then on July 9th, she very quietly snuck out while people were eating dinner. She just stopped breathing. So we will miss her very much.
Yeah, I'm her son, Ulta. I don't want to ruin the music by itself, but I thought I should say something about the first piece I'm playing. It's a movement from a sonata Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart wrote when his mother died. And, you know, anecdotally, I had ended up with some people from spiritualism where she actually came through a medium because he was doubting the information, and I started crying. And she said to me, "Don't cry, love me." And now how can somebody say that? You know, I didn't, you know, I tried, didn't understand it, didn't know whether I could. I understand it now, thanks to my mother and her friend up there. They taught me that.
Hi. So we found some of my mother's memoirs as we were looking through for photographs and whatnot. And there was one that spoke to all of us. I'd like to share it with you. This is in her own words. It's called Water. I grew up below sea level in a Dutch polder. When you would walk on the dike, the water on one side was much higher than the land on the other side. An image that brought home the danger of water. If it broke through the dike, we would all be flooded. So the image of water is a many-faceted symbol built into my blood. It is something to be dreaded and conquered, but also to be enjoyed and interacted with, to be sailed on and played in, because it is all around you as far as the eye can see. There was no way to avoid it, just like you can't avoid reality, feeling, or the unconscious, of which water is a symbol, as Jung would have it. If you try and act like it is not there, it will run you in ways that can be disastrous. If you befriend and respect it, however, it makes a healthy, productive life possible. In the same way, we were invited to live with water and respect its life-giving resources that feed us. But we also needed to heed it, lest we would be overwhelmed by it. I did not understand the symbolic importance of water and our coexistence with it at the time, but I knew then that I had my own relationship with it. Water gave me life. When I was in our sailboat, rowboat, or in a kayak, I felt whole, alive, and at peace. The reeds, wildflowers, the waterfowl, the fish, and the frogs were my friends. Confusing to me was that I was not allowed to sail on Sundays. My father, the headmaster of a Christian elementary school, admitted that perhaps it was not so bad in itself, but I would offend people who saw me sailing. It was confusing at best, because my parents meant well. I realize now that these rules, like hanging on to dogmas, were a desperate way to keep the water of life at bay, because it poses danger to the status quo, to safety. Just like in the famous story of the Dutch boy who stopped the water by putting his thumb in a hole in the dike to prevent a flood from covering the land. As I grew older, I got more and more in touch with water as a symbol of life. When I started to explore dreams, the first dream I remember shaking me up was that I was fishing through a hole in the ice, catching fish after fish. The frozen feelings, the frozen water of life had broken open, and a deepening of understanding was beginning. There was a world beyond the literal that gave me for the first time a hint at knowing and experiencing that came from within and not from outside. Not from outside tales and formalities and oughts. I experienced it as something I could trust. Living right was not about keeping the water of life at bay, but about living with it as a precious, unending resource. Later, I moved away from the polder, pursuing my education and traveling more of the world. It became my career and vocation to explore the water of life as it feeds all of us, for good as well as bad. I discovered that, just as we have to examine rules that come from outside, we also have to examine what comes from within, and not blindly follow it either. The water of life, life-giving as it is, can also be murky and dark. I learned that we can't do good if we don't recognize the opposite inevitably calls forth. That to live right, whatever that means, is a lifelong search for consciousness, making mistakes, and then trying to correct the course and not simply following rules. In all these years, a part of me missed the actual living with water. I find myself now living in a condo on a good-sized pond with many of the same forms of wildlife like fish, waterfowl, frogs, and birds that I knew as a child. For a while, I wondered why this place immediately felt like home until it hit me. Of course, it is the water again. It gives me peace. It somehow touches my soul. Thank you.
Anybody wants for 10 seconds to stand up just because you've been sitting for a long time? Go ahead. Then sit down and read it. Yeah, stretch if you like. Do whatever feels good. All right. This will be short and sweet, as the woodpecker said to the worm. I'm honored to have been asked to just speak very briefly about Inie as I knew her. In 1987, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And I knew as I went on that journey that I needed some help. By this time, I'd graduated from Calvin Seminary, and I had been a pastor for a few years. And I knew quite a few therapists, and I had never met one that I thought I could visit with for therapy. And what I wanted was a Jungian therapist who could do dream work with me. I shared that longing with my good friend Lillian Siegel, who was in the interfaith movement with me. She's my Jewish friend. And she had met Rule and Inie at Fountain Street when they were doing Joseph Campbell stuff. And so she had gotten to know her and said, Marty, I think you would be fine with Inie. So on the strength of Lillian's recommendation, Inie accepted doing therapy with me as I went through my journey with cancer. And it was an absolutely wonderful experience. She was so wise and so understanding, 14 years older than me. She had life experience, which in many ways was very different and in other ways was very similar, because I'm 100% Dutch on both sides, and had been in the Netherlands, and had an aunt who worked in the underground with the Nazi occupation, rescuing Jewish people. So we had enough in common with that and many other things to just say that she undergirded my journey and gave me the wisdom and the courage and the gentle challenges and the learning that really helped me. And there were two things I learned from her that I still practice as part of the inner journey, which is ongoing. And the one was to draw mandalas, which are round art in a circle, as Jung himself did as part of his journey. And she guided me into that, and I still do it. And the second thing was active imagination, which she also taught me, which she referred me to Robert Johnson's wonderful book about that. And I still do that. And she also, I was also really plunging into the feminist movement, and so was she. So in that regard, we very mutually encouraged one another on that journey, and she led me to wonderful Jungian feminist authors like Jean Shinoda Bolen, and Helen Luke, who I had the privilege of meeting when she was still alive and living at Apple Farm near St. Gregory's Abbey. In those same, after I had finished my course with Inie in official therapy, we kept in touch as friends, and meanwhile I had some other friends with whom we started something we called a dream group. And we met, there were just a few of us, 5 or 6, and we met every month to talk about our dreams from a Jungian perspective. One of us moved away, and I recommended that Inie take her place. And Inie accepted. And from that time on, for more than 20 years, she was part of the dream group. And we would meet in each other's homes, and once a year, we would take a week-long retreat in either Sedona or Hilton Head Island. Our family owned timeshares there, and I could use a week in each place every other year, and we would gather and do intensive stuff. We also went a couple times to Morning Star, where Inie led our dream group in a never-to-be-forgotten experience doing holotropic breath work. Whoa, if you've ever done that, you won't forget it. And she did a great job of it. It was a very fine, moving, deep experience for us. And that brings me to the fact that at Morning Star, I had, from almost its beginning, helping Julie Kiefer, who was its founder, and then Elise, create and expand Morning Star. And I was on what they fondly called the sistery rather than the board. And there again, someone left the sistery because they were moving away. And I thought a perfect person would be Inie. And she said yes. And so Inie joined the sistery, and Barbara Carville here has been on the sistery, and we had many wonderful adventures together. And she again was such a valuable, solid, faithful, interesting, good friend and colleague, and in both of those places I got to know her in wonderful ways. And when Jean was reading the water thing that she wrote, it brought back to my mind vividly a vivid memory of the Betsy River when our sistery floated down the river in inner tubes, all linked together, singing and laughing, all the way down to the mouth of the river into the big lake. And that was just one of the ways that she enjoyed water, as did we all. So in conclusion, for me, Inie's departure from this plane, from this earth, is sort of like when our neighbor had a huge tree taken out that I had looked at every day for years and years and years, a huge oak tree. But he wanted to build a patio there. So I had that huge, beautiful old oak taken away, which I used to sit and gaze at and pray with in my prayer corner. Well, if any of you have ever had a beautiful big tree in the landscape of your life, you know what it feels like if it's not there anymore. It leaves a big hole. It does. That's how I feel about Inie's departure. But then, you know, when a great big tree falls in the forest, it keeps giving life. It's on the floor of the forest, and the birds and the insects and the animals are all being fed by that great tree for a long, long time. And I think that's how Inie will be feeding us all for a long time.
now is the time where people can give their own personal testimonies about how Inie blessed the life. And I will start with that. My friendship with Inie is at least 25, 28 years old. And we both were on the sistery, and you already learned that the sistery means it's a board members of a women's retreat center named Morning Star, south of Cadillac. We gave each other rides to the monthly meetings, alternating. Sometimes I drove and sometimes she drove. It always took about 75 minutes. And during those 75 minutes, we could talk about the joys and woes of our personal lives, and especially about Jung. And she tried to convince me, and I tried to convince me more about maybe Christian reformedness, and it was also very good discussions. And then after the meetings, on our way back to GR, we had then ample times hashing over the issues argued at Morning Star in the meetings. Because you have to know that Morning Star was run by Julie and Elise, and both loved fiercely Morning Star, but they loved each in a very different way. Julie wanted it frugal, minimal expense, and minimal interference in the wooded landscape. Whereas Elise, on the other hand, wanted it beautiful, creative, more luxurious, and did not see any harm in embellishing nature. Elise wanted some trees to be felled so that her garden had more light, and Julie balked. In this situation, Inie's wisdom was very helpful, and she always found the right words, and with her big, generous heart, she could always see and understand both sides and prevent major blow-ups. This was really a very, very great gift to Morning Star. For the longest time, going to the sisterly meeting at Morning Star was actually a sleepover, more like a pajama party. And we came Friday night. Everybody brought their best food. Inie always a lovingly prepared fruit salad and a bar of the most darkest chocolate she could ever find. And we had great times dancing and singing and having a sauna, horsing around and feeling young and happy. I think the last time we were free and creative and fun-filled and young was a celebration of Inie's 80th birthday at the deck of Agnes Masseling in Grand Rapids when she still lived there. We laughed and giggled about the spectacularly funny gifts we found for each other. Well, I think you were good enough to not select one of those. This was maybe not so kosher. Okay. In the last 5 or 6 years, when a new board of Morning Star was created and Inie was not so mobile any longer, we still had good fun. Louise Sondervan also lived at the same condo association as Inie and myself, and we became very good neighbors to the Bijkerks. On Saturdays, around 11:30, Louise picked up Inie and me, and we went to Horrocks, a garden center, grocery store, and eating place, and had a soup and free coffee. There was much laughter and teasing and more laughter when neither Louise nor I were able to get Inie up and out of her chair until some helpful, strong, and strapping young man came and helped. I was important for Inie as a friend, and I'm glad that, and you talked about Inie's childhood in the Netherlands, because she did not grow up with the best image of Germans. And sometimes she told me, I'm glad I met you, you are a good German. So, and that made me feel very happy that I could be that for her. I miss Inie, my faithful, wise, generous, and kind friend and neighbor. Thank you.
I didn't plan on this, but you know how things work out. My name is Marlene, and I am now the president of the new board at Morningstar. And so I know Inie two different ways. One is through Morningstar. I had the privilege of driving Inie and Barbara up to that meeting where we switched from the sistery to the board. And they called out a new board, and I answered, as did 6 or 7 other women. So Morningstar has been nurtured by you guys, Barbara, Marty, Inie, and Mary. You've been on it too. And is there anybody else I don't know from Morningstar? Katie? I met Katie on a Zoom. We had a meeting with Julie Kiefer when she passed away last week. And I just met Marty face to face right now. I've talked to you before. But the other way that I know Inie and loved her through my mom, who was Louise Sonderfan. And Louise passed away March 20th, and we just had her memorial on Saturday. So to be now in Inie's presence feels pretty good.
The right words. What you said spoke to me. I was going through a very difficult time in my life, and I met a woman who knew Inie and had collected those words, and she spoke them to me. I asked her how long my therapy was going to take. And she said, however long it takes. So I knew Inie before I actually met her. She saved my life, as she did so many others. Her words kind of went gently out into the world and touched so many. I wrote a little poem for her. Her grace went out into the world on gentle footsteps. Words spoken and insights exchanged, soothed and enlarged the heart. Generosity and grace enfolded those she taught to love. Like a midwife, she helped so many give birth to themselves.
Hello. I am Bobby Rosenkrantz. I saw Inie for therapy too. And together we put together a book. And what I want to say, I really want her family and her close friends to hear, is Inie's voice went a long, long ways. I was stunned when we received letters from Japan, South Africa, around. I was just amazed. People saying two things commonly. You told my story, and the other is, how do I get to see Inie? Which is what a lot of people felt. It was an adventure, and I really want you kids to hear how much, and you, Rule, how much her voice has carried out into the world. Really has. She was an important person. Because we wrote that early, I've ended up knowing most of the big players in that field. Served on a commission for the National Institute of Mental Health to look at female perpetrators. And it went a long ways. So I'm a writer. I got trained as a psychotherapist, and I went on and have retired, and mostly I'm writing. And I've written nonfiction books, so I wanted to write fiction. I'm going to do it, you know? Well, first I had to learn how. And I'm working on this, and it's about somebody who has some early childhood struggles, gets into therapy, works their way through. Okay. And has to go back and work it all through. Last night, I haven't reread the book that Inie and I wrote in, 40 years? Honestly, but I reread what Inie wrote, and I thought, this is a rerun. I have done what Inie did for me with other clients, and I have now written a story that's a rerun. A little, not totally, but a lot of it. Inie has had a huge impact, not just on me, but a lot of people. And I really want you to know that, all of you kids, and there were a lot of little adventures around the site. She did therapy at her house. And one day, I went to my appointed time, and one of you kids let me in. Said she'd be up in a minute. And so I start up the stairs just as one of the daughters came out of the shower, totally naked, walking down. And I thought, I'll wait on the porch, okay? So it was, and we actually went to the land where I grew up and walked around and looked at wildflowers and all of that. When I was at Michigan, and for my graduate training, I bummed a ride with her one time, and I laughed last night about her saying that I taught her about being pale-faced, which made me laugh, because what it brought to mind was we stopped at a rest stop between here and Ann Arbor, and I always read all these historic markers, and she said, those amuse me. There's so little history. And I said, yeah, if you only count white people's history here. And about probably 30 miles down the road, she said, you're right. She was a wonderful woman, and you're blessed. And I want to, I don't know if I can sing this, but I'm going to. Within the movement of people who were working their way through early childhood pain, there were a lot of conferences where I've spoken, and there's a song, and I'll sing you one verse. It's not what We Shall Overcome did, but it's, oh, be joyful, Oh, be jubilant, push your sorrows far away. We rejoice and sing together this Freedom Day. People will continue to find each other, and this is good. And Inie found a lot of us in this room. I know she did. I know she did. So bless you all. And know, you kids and grandkids and Rule, her voice is going to keep going. It will. So bless you all for letting her have the freedom to do it. Thank you.
Well, first of all, of course, thank you for wanting to come here to, as the program says, celebrate the life of Inie, who lived a long life and lived it fully and well. And that word celebrate has made me ponder a little bit as to what it exactly is that we celebrate. And I think often celebration is only for the outcome of what has been a real struggle, sometimes with real danger, perils, and a real risk of losing. What I think I would like to emphasize a little bit at the end of this celebration is that we might sometimes do just as well in reminiscing about exactly what it was that had to be overcome. And that certainly, for me, personally, is something that I learned about Inie and what she had to overcome. Because there were many times when, in our relationship, I fell short of recognizing just what it was that she had to cope with. It wasn't easy, always, for Inie to do and to continue to do what she had decided to do, often against the advice of well-meaning, good people. But she had to decide to go against that advice and follow that inner voice, of which you have heard something today mentioned in various parts of this program. See, it already began at the beginning, when we became more known to each other and began to enjoy each other's company, and finally married. And we had a lot of things to experience together already before we got married. At the very beginning already, as fellow students, as beginning assistants at that psychological institute at the Free University, which, by the way, Abraham Kuyper, who founded it, wanted to be the Free University because he wanted it to be free of both state and church. And I mention that because that issue of being free of church became later one of our biggest problems that Inie and I shared when we moved to this country. Well, we were then gradually getting to know each other a little bit more. We eventually graduated. Inie was ahead of me. And that was a really good day, by the way, because we managed to do it on the same day. And Inie just went into the room for the final comprehensive exams an hour earlier than I did. But she remained my senior then. And in many ways, also later in life, that's what she remained. Well, we became colleagues, lovers, and we married. And that was a first step for Inie of having to give up a lot of what she already had gained and what had been a promise for the future. Because, think about it. First of all, she had to give up her name. That was still necessary at that time in the Netherlands. The woman took the name of the husband. And with that came a whole lot more. Well, for instance, also later in America, when we were here, she was in her 30s, and I was just beginning to get to be 30. And then she wanted her own bank account. But I had to sit there and sign a paper that said that it was okay with me. Today that is fortunately different. But it was a long time for me because I began to realize that there were many such things that she had to give up. And some were real sacrifices. That date of the marriage that is mentioned in the obituary and in the program has been mentioned, by the way, is not wrong. Factually, it is perfectly accurate. But one of the examples where something that is correct can still be not true. Officially, we married on September 6th of 1957. But if you would examine our wedding ring, you would see engraved on the inside another date. It was Friday, the 13th of July of 1956, a good year earlier. And the reason why that was so was an example of many that Inie took as decision to not go by what was conventional and the rule, but by what went with her own inner voice and conviction. Because it was on that day that she said, finally, yes to me. And we decided that from then on we would do things together, come what may, and that for us was really the beginning of our relationship and our marriage. And then it was followed by some of the things that you have already heard. We continued for a while as colleagues after we got married. And then we planned to go into our own home because we had just heard that the new apartment that was in a building that was still to be completed was now available to us. And so we intended to start making our own home, to start a family, if possible, and to settle down in the Netherlands in good jobs, both of us, and to live the good life. But wouldn't you know, that actually was the beginning of one of the biggest sacrifices that Inie had to make. On the day that we got the keys to our new apartment, there also arrived a letter from the United States, from a place we didn't know anything about, called Calvin College in Grand Rapids, with an invitation to me to come, at least for a couple of years, and teach psychology. I won't go into how that came about. It's a long story. But, well, what were we to do now? For me, it was a great thing and a real adventure to look forward to. And I had long wanted to see and get to know America ever since I was a boy of 8 or 9 and began to read adventure stories for boys. Many of those involving the United States. Cowboys, Indians, grizzly bears, mountains, the deserts, heroes. I wanted to see America ever since I read those little books. And here was a possibility of doing it as a mature adult who had forgotten about those Jones books for a long time. And what was Inie to do? Well, we talked about it, got stern and very well-meant advice from colleagues, from friends, from family. Don't go. You don't know what you are getting yourselves into. You have it good here. This can be good for a long time. What do you know about America? But we decided that we would go. And that was a big step for Inie, because it also meant things like giving up a good job, giving up a solid future in a career in this country that you know, go to a place where you're unfamiliar with the customs, with the social structures, and with the church. And don't forget, a new, unfamiliar language on the basis of only 2 years of high school English. But we decided to go, even though in the meantime, in the next few months, our first child was born. So there we went, on the boat, as you have seen in that one picture in the review that our oldest daughter, who was then 6 weeks old, told us about. And we came to the United States. And I started a really wonderful time for me. Teaching, really becoming familiar with a new language, and being able to pick up again my violin and join the orchestra, and giving some recitals in those 2 years that we stayed. But for Inie, it was very different. But she never complained. She never looked back with regret. She completely and totally had decided and lived by that. Not by the official announcements from community or church in the Netherlands, but listening to her own voice. And maybe here I should mention why it had come about in Inie and me, that we should live our own life from the inside more than from the outside. for Inie earlier than for me, but later also more and more for me. We had become acquainted with the life and work, the writings, the accomplishments of Carl Jung. And that gave us a great deal of help for all the years to follow. It started when we were students at the university in Amsterdam, the Free University. And we became acquainted with his thinking and his work. And that's where Inie also got the advice that she finally followed. Live your own life. Listen to the voice in your own heart as well as mind. Pay attention to that which wants to live and come about. And that's what Inie did. She did it when she married me, against the advice of some in her own family. She did it when we had to make the difficult choice of going or not going to the United States. She did it when here she had to somehow manage, in many ways, troubles that I didn't have, but that she met, from the loss of job, of income for herself, to having to take care as a mother of our children, having to become a real part of the community, which she did. So that I want to underscore here that we should also remember the things that Inie had to face as difficulties, and that she finally managed to conquer, because it was a fight sometimes, but never a fight with me, and never a fight with her own conscience. Later, though, there came other challenges. After 2 years, we went back to the Netherlands, where I got a good job at the university to teach some and to give exams to students for my major professor. And where Inie saw possibilities again coming up for a career of her own. But then there was the offer from Calvin College to me to become a full-time tenured professor and to help, and that was the major challenge, to start and build a psychological institute modeled mostly on what had been accomplished at the Free University, in that psychological institute where we started our studies and later work for Inie and me. It was particularly that challenge that was very attractive to me, and I must say, fortunately, also to Inie. So again, against the advice of many well-meaning people around us, we went. Now with 3 children. And Inie, being pregnant, was number 4. It was different this time, even in terms of difficulties for Inie, than it had been the first time, because this was for keeps. And the possibilities for another career for herself didn't look all that great. And she now really had to learn to cope with a new language and a new community, and the differences between the church here and the same named Christian Reformed Church in the Netherlands, and the differences between a school that was here a church school and was under the supervision of the officials of the church, rather than a free of church and school university in the Netherlands. But things went well. She managed to adjust quite well, and so did I. I had an easy time of it. It was a grand time, especially when that institute came into existence, and I could help to lead that and have it branch out into more than just a place where a few students could get some practicums, more than a place where students of the college could come for counseling, more than a place where people would come for counseling and therapy from the community. I had a grand time. Until a kind of day of reckoning came finally also for me. Now, Inie and I, working together in our striving to become more adult, more mature, and particularly also doing work toward finding more meaning in this whole business of life as a human being. And where again, the writings of Carl Jung were very helpful to us both. But which also led to more and more getting views developed in ourselves that were divergent from what was expected, and rightly so, of a professor teaching at Calvin College, a church school, with the expectations for views and behavior that began to become more and more for us not what we really believed in. And finally, we had to discuss, what shall we do now? But the decision came for both of us. See, all those years until then, we had learned to come together more as two people in search for the same things. And together we decided I should leave Calvin College. And I did. I resigned. At first that was not accepted. I was offered a sabbatical, free of any expectations, to think things over. Well, that took Inie and me then 2 days. And then I had to tell President Spoelhoff, whom I respected very much, liked very much, admired a great deal, and who liked us, sorry, I'm going. But there we were, both of us without a job or any income, and what were we going to do now? We thought of going back to the Netherlands, but the Netherlands was not the same anymore as there had been only 10 years before. So that was a jump in the dark too. And then what? Well, that's when the saving moment came. There was an invitation from Grand Valley for me. I'd given a couple lectures there on dreams, and somehow there was enough to encourage some people there to tell me that if I wanted to, there might be a place for me on the regular faculty. So Inie and I decided, well, at least try for a few years. Then we can stay here. The children are now well in school. They are a little older. Inie will have more time. And so we did. And from then on, things went exceedingly well. I will have to cut this a little short. I hope you will forgive me for that. Let me just say that all in all, those years after Calvin became once again very good years for both Inie and me. You have heard that she managed to get going again in teaching, and then even more so in psychotherapy. And it was a surprise for me right now, tonight, to hear from Bobby Rosenkrantz just how far Inie's work had reached in the 50 years and more that followed my move into a full-time teaching position at Grand Valley. And then came old age, and now we were a little better prepared for that. Particularly also because Inie had done work on dealing with the problems of not only living, but also death and dying. So we were prepared when finally the end came. It was, in a sense, of course, rough, but in another way, it was fulfilling, because our best hopes and expectations had succeeded, and now it was time to go and rest. I will not go too far into the story of exactly how Inie came to her end before me. But I do want to mention something of the way in which she finally died, which to me was a confirmation of all that we had learned and that we thought was good. Inie had become very old, very weak, needed a lot of help, which we got from various agencies, as has been mentioned before. But to the end, she did not complain, she didn't struggle, she didn't fight, she didn't try to find refuge in bargaining with God, as seems to be one of the stages that has been described for dying. I guess she just skipped over most of those stages and went to acceptance in her own quiet way. And I will never forget those last couple of days. As has been said, she was at home. That had been our first priority, to stay together and remain at home. I still had communication with her, although there were very few other people who still managed to have that. Only 2 nights before she died, she and I, during the night, had our last real meeting of the minds. Her eyes were open, she recognized me, she understood what I was talking about, trying to bring up some old memories that we had shared together in doing this or doing that. She couldn't talk. She couldn't speak anymore, but it was clear to me that she was there with me. 2 days later was her last day. She died Friday, July 9 of this year. She was very still, very quiet, all day long. Didn't take in any more food, just a little bit to drink sometimes. But by the end of the afternoon, she was just still, not moving, no facial changes of expression, And it became clear that we were closing our life with her. Early in the evening, our very competent and very caring helper, Shar, tried to give her a little bit of something to drink. It didn't work. She was not responding anymore. But she still was breathing very softly, slowly. So we just continued, the four of us that were there, I and two of our daughters and Shar, sitting around the table in the living room where Inie was also in her bed, the hospital bed. And then, a while later, Shar got up to check if she could give Inie a little bit more to drink yet. And then Shar said, I think she's not breathing. So Ginny got up, went over to the bed, only a couple of yards away. We had not heard anything or seen any movement or any restlessness or agitation. Ginny gets to the bed, bends over and checks. And all she could say was, she's gone. And she was. There had been no struggle, no final twitching or moving. Inie had just simply stopped breathing and left quietly, without any sign of anything else but peacefulness, restfulness. That will always stay with us. Thank you. I will end, though, by quoting a few words from T.S. Eliot, which I think characterize what Inie and I, for a long life together, had been trying to do. The lines go like this. I hope I remember it. We shall not cease from exploration. And at the end of our exploring, we will arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. And all shall be well. All manner of things shall be well. Where is my key? Oh, here. Where's David? You tell him.
out the door, make a right, go down to the corner, and follow the right. We're just missing by roads as soon as the family is either way to that place.